The Romantic music era was a reaction against the philosophy of the music of the classical era. Romantic music differed from classical music by emphasizing emotion, individuality, and drama, instead of classic music's focus on structure, balance, and clarity. Romantic composers used more chromatic harmony, dramatic shifts in dynamics, and freer, longer forms, often inspired by nature or literature, while the classical melodies were typically lyrical, symmetrical, and built from four-bar phrases. Romantic melodies were longer, more passionate, and they were used to convey a mood or a narrative. Romantic harmony moved away from the classical period's predictable, structured tonality of the tonic, dominant, and subdominant to a richer, more chromatic progression with more frequent modulations and dissonances. This video demonstrates how the Romantic era used chromatic movement and suspensions to move away from the classical era progressions. Another change was to the standardized orchestra. The Romantic orchestra grew significantly to include a wider variety of instruments. And while classical music was predominantly absolute music, music for its own sake, Romantic composers increasingly embraced program music, which was music that told a specific story or depicted a particular scene. The rise of middle class and the decline of aristocratic patronage granted composers greater creative freedom and allowed them to make these calls in their music. The social changes coincided with the Industrial Revolution's impact on instrument manufacturing. Instruments were improved with features like a cast iron frame for pianos, which would allow for a greater dynamic range and much louder volume. Also, the introduction of valves to brass instruments enabled them to play chromatic scales with great versatility. It was also during this time that the saxophone was invented in 1840. It was introduced as a new sound to the symphonic orchestra. There were dozens of prominent composers during the Romantic period, and we don't have time to meet all of them. But here are those considered most influential by music historians. Let's start in Germany. The greatest German composers of the Romantic period include Ludwig Beethoven, Johann Brahms, Felix Mendelssohn, Robert Schumann, and Richard Wagner. These composers were pivotal in shaping the transition from the classical era to the Romantic era. Richard Wagner was he had a profound influence on the Romantic period of music and its composers. He came up with revolutionary innovations in harmony, form, and the dramatic integration of all arts, which he called Geschkunstwerk. He pushed the boundaries of traditional tonality with extreme chromaticism, suspensions, and quickly shifting tonal centers, exemplified by the Tristan chord. This chord laid the groundwork for modern music and inspired composers to explore atonality. Please watch the first 3 minutes of this video, which helps explain the Tristan chord. Wagner also elevated the use of leitmotifs. Leitmotifs are recurring musical themes associated with specific characters or ideas. He wove them in and out into a continuous musical fabric that influenced future classical and today's film scoring composers. He moved away from the traditional operatic structures toward endless melody and expanded the size and scope of the orchestra, adding new instruments like the Wagner tuba. The influence of his rich orchestration, complex harmony, and large-scale works is evident in the music of Richard Strauss, Gustav Mahler, Anton Bruckner, and other composers like Claude Debussy and even Arnold Schoenberg. These composers had to choose whether to to either embrace Wagner's music or react against it. Wagner was a pivotal figure who brought the Romantic era to its climax and simultaneously paved the way for the radical changes of 20th century music. Here's one of his most famous pieces, Ride of the Valkyrie. In Austria, the greatest Austrian composers of the Romantic period include Franz Schubert, Gustav Mahler, Anton Bruckner, and Johann Strauss. All of these are known for their significant contributions to symphonic and choral music. While earlier Austrian composers like Mozart and Beethoven are considered giants of the transition from classicism to romanticism, these four are central to the distinctly romantic era in Austrian music. In fact, if you travel to Vienna today, you will find concert venues that are still dedicated to the music of Johann Strauss, the father of the waltz. Here is one of his most famous pieces, The Blue Danube. And in Poland, the greatest Polish composer of the Romantic period was Frédéric Chopin. He was most famous for his piano solo work. Here is one of his pieces that reflect Polish heritage. The greatest French composers of the Romantic period include Hector Berlioz, Camille Saint-Saëns, Georges Bizet, César Franck, Claude Debussy, and Maurice Ravel. These men continued to innovate and develop styles that would influence the future of all music. Here's a famous aria from Bizet's opera Carmen. In Czechoslovakia, the great Romantic composers of that period are Bedřich Smetana, Antonín Dvořák, Zdeněk Fibič, and Joseph Suk. Smetana is known as the father of Czech music for his nationalistic works, while Dvořák achieved worldwide recognition and drew heavily on Czech folk music in his compositions. Here is Slavonic Dance, Opus 72, based on Czech folk music. Edvard Grieg and Jean Sibelius were considered Romantic composers, but they were also prominent in the nationalistic movement. They used their music to express and promote the culture, folk music, and national identity of their respective countries, Norway and Finland. Grieg is possibly most famous for his Hall of the Mountain King and Morning Mood. In these recordings, you will hear the new flutes of the 19th century and bassoons that have more power and bigger sounds. Franz Liszt was an incredible showman, considered the first true superstar of classical music. He was known for his dazzling technique, flamboyant personality, and theatrical stage presence, which created a phenomenon called Listomania among his fans. He was also a pioneer who invented the solo recital and established many modern conventions of the classical concert experience. Another virtuoso of the Romantic era was Niccolò Paganini. He was considered a rock star of his time due to his flamboyant showmanship, incredible virtuosity, and the near mythical status he achieved, which included rumors that he had made a deal with the devil. His intense performances, scandalous personal life, and ability to draw hysterical crowds mirror the characteristics of a modern-day rock star. And we will end our study of the Romantic period with the Romantic composers of Russia. The greatest of this list would be Peter Tchaikovsky, followed by Alexander Borodin, Modest Mussorgsky, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and Sergei Rachmaninoff. Here is Tchaikovsky's Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies from his Nutcracker Ballet. In this, you will hear a new instrument called the celesta, invented in 1886, which Tchaikovsky held as a secret that no one knew about it until he premiered it at the ballet. And finally, Sergei Rachmaninoff. He's widely considered a composer who bridged the Romantic period to the 20th century. Here are two of his pieces, Prelude in C-sharp minor and Adagio from his Symphony No. 2.